Hey everybody, welcome to the Magnificast again. This is episode 7. This is sort of our short episode. We're going to talk about Paul Virilio and his explicit connections with Christianity. And stay tuned for the end of the episode for like a really special announcement about summer reading group and Patreon and how you can give us a little bit of your money. Paul Virilio is a dude that we've talked about a bunch throughout our podcast. We reference him almost every episode, or just about. We'll see. I don't know. We'll go back. We'll make edits. We'll include his name if I'm wrong. We talked about him a lot in episode 4 with Josh Christensen. We talked about war and cinema. So if you don't know anything about Paul Virilio, maybe you should go listen to that episode first. Or maybe not. You can just listen to this one. I don't know. You do what you want. I'm not in charge of your life. Paul Virilio is cool. He's a media philosopher. He's an architect. He's an urbanist. He's a historian of technology. He's a historian of war. He has lots of interesting things to say about the combination of war and technology. But most importantly, he's also a Christian. Go figure. Virilio gets read in a bunch of different discourses by artists and architects, but at the very base of his work is an underlying Christianity, and I think that Christianity is often overlooked in these other fields by other people. So Dean and I are going to talk about his Christianity and how that plays out in his larger work, because I think you can't really understand exactly what he's talking about in terms of speed and technology if you can't understand at least the basis of his Christianity. So Dean and I found a bunch of good quotes where he talks about it kind of explicitly in a book called Virilio Live. Virilio Live is just a collection of interviews where someone's asking him questions and kind of interrogating him. He pretty explicitly never talks about his Christianity, or he never writes about it, really. He doesn't think he's very good at it, and kind of just leaves it up to us to figure out on the back end here. But it comes out in these conversations with different interlocutors, and we can maybe look at them and decipher some of his religious leanings and his political leanings as well. So Dean, where should we start off?
Maybe we should start off where he starts off in terms of his Christianity, with his conversion story, or how he sort of explains his conversion. So one thing I thought was really interesting is he says that he converts as a result of his encounters with worker priests, and that's a really interesting thing. So just to kind of, maybe I'll just read a little bit of him telling his own story. So he says, when I was young, I converted to Christianity. When I was 18, as an adult, the war had just ended then, the Second World War he's talking about, and I had seen terrible things, because he grew up in occupied France, and that was also one of the reasons for my conversion to Christianity. But then you must know that I converted in the company of worker priests. Worker priests are, in France, those priests who take an industrial job and go to live with the factory workers. They do not display their pastoral cross. I chose to convert with a worker priest because I wanted something real, not some religious show with a guy in a costume. So that's basically setting sort of the tone for Virilio's Catholicism. Very committed to workers in general, actually, and also very committed to, what's being symbolized in a way by priests, but also rejecting a certain kind of symbolism insofar as he sees them as maybe a little bit out of touch. So he's invested in religion that finds itself in the streets, as a lot of these worker priests actually did in France.
So that's really interesting that he's after something like a little bit more real than a guy in a costume. I appreciate that. It's like funny because as like a Protestant, and a particularly like low church Protestant, I really like the guy in the costume. But I get it. I get that you want that like real connection to the streets. Which is very dromological for Virilio. I think that is that like underlying ethos of wanting like real connection to like real workers is interesting because it connects to his politics pretty explicitly. In the section right before that, you didn't read it. The interviewer asks him if he was interested in Marxism at any point, and the answer is not really, but he might feel at home in the Paris Commune or as an anarcho-syndicalist or something like that, right? So he wants this like real connection to real people, and not the majesty and mystery of like the big church or something. There's a maybe like a thing going on there.
Yeah, actually, so two things I want to say about that. One is, so Virilio is actually indirectly disagreeing completely with Marshall McLuhan on this point. So there's a really funny passage in one of McLuhan's addresses about religion where he talks about how costumes are like the most important thing for the church today because people want to dress in costumes. And McLuhan was talking about sort of the 60s and 70s and, hippies and whatever. Mm-hmm. That's explicitly what he's trying to, like the counterculture. And basically McLuhan is saying people want roles to play, right? That's one of his big things, is that role-playing culture is what happens when there's electric media.
Yeah.
But Virilio is saying exactly the opposite, that like the last thing we need is more roles to play. Like what you need is something very real and very grounded and tangible, and something that isn't sort of showy or role-y, if you will.
Do you think that, I mean, so McLuhan's saying that, if I recall, he's saying that like about like as a cultural diagnosis, though, right?
Yeah, he is.
Because Virilio, it just seems like he's kind of outside that diagnosis. Like he wants to reject that, right?
Yeah, well, it's weird though because McLuhan often refuses to be prescriptive, but in his religious writings, he sometimes crosses that line in a weird way. So anyway, I've just always found that an interesting kind of juxtaposition between the two of them.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the other thing I wanted to say is in that passage you were just referencing, so he's talking about his Marxism, and he says that his dad was a Marxist, a communist, Italian communist, and then his mom was a Breton. And so she was a French Catholic, actually. He doesn't say that right here, but he does say it elsewhere. And it's funny because in this interview he says, my mother was a Breton and my father Italian. Like every young boy, I had to choose between my mother and father. So, although I have a lot of respect for my father, I totally reject his political views. I absolutely can't be a communist. And it's very funny because what he does choose by siding with his mom is her Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an interesting side note, I guess.
Super interesting how that plays out and how he explains it in terms of like lineage and family. It's kind of sweet, actually. But that... just like for all of our actual true real communist listeners out there who might have like a sudden allergy to this guy, in the very next sentence he does say like, I have nothing against socialism, I belong to the left. So that's right. Maybe he's not not a communist in like the I don't know, like 1960s French kind of way of being a communist, but a communist in a different sort of way.
Yeah, and a lot of the worker priests that he would have spent time with would have been explicit members of communist parties in France. Yeah. So, the very Catholics who inspired him would have been anarchists and communists anyway. So,
yeah, it's good company, I think.
Yeah, so a lot of these worker priests he hung out with would have been communists and anarchists. But really soon after that, the interviewer asks him directly about his own anarcho-Christianity or Christianity in general. So the interviewer says he asks him specifically about Gabriel Marcel and Jacques Ellul, who are also critics of technology. And it's interesting because Virilio says he sees linkages with Ellul, but not so much with Marcel, which is like pedantically interesting, but not for a conversation about the left here as much. So I guess I wonder what you would think, Matt, about Jacques Ellul as that connection in particular, since we already talked about Ellul in an earlier episode, in our first episode.
I guess it's a good time to revisit Ellul, since basically nobody could hear that episode anyways. We can kind of circle back with more volume, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious that that Virilio would make that connection to Ellul. I mean, they're both French, they're Christians. However, Ellul is a Protestant while Virilio is Catholic, and they both write about like technology and like how it can be bad sometimes. Jacques Ellul more than Virilio. Yeah, it's really interesting. Interesting linkage to make, and the heading of that section that you're referencing to it's worth noting too that it's called Anarcho-Christianity. So I think that Virilio picks up that like sort of mantle and runs with it. Something I'd never really, I hadn't ever really kind of connected by myself. The anarchist part, at least. The Christian part, I think, is pretty clear, but the anarchist thing is a little bit harder to make the connection. In that section, though, it gets really interesting. So the connection between Elul and Virilio is like it's there, obviously, just biographically, but they're like they could not be more different thinkers, especially with their approaches to technology. Elul is like man, he is such a Protestant. He's just like fervently against, like ready to live on the hill with his cows and anti-vaxxing them. Where Virilio actually cares about like real politics. Sorry, all the Elul listeners out there. Sorry, Jacques Ellul listening to this podcast right now.
From the grave.
From the grave, that's right. Yeah, I mean, they have like a huge connection. They're doing similar work, but I don't know. Virilio is way more connected to real politics to me and to real Christianity. I think for the same reason. What makes Virilio hard to pin down, where Elul is very easy to pin down, is that like Virilio does not talk about his faith as explicitly as Elul does. Like in Anarchy and Christianity, it's just like everywhere about like, yeah, I mean, theological statements are not hard to find. Like statements of belief are not hard to find. They're just like throughout the text completely. But Virilio, not so much. We have to sift through these interviews to find anything about his like expressions of faith. In fact, like, I mean, we didn't sift. We control F'd. We control F through these interviews to find them. Anyways, there's an interesting note I think that Virilio makes here. He just says, sorry, this is what you're just coming off of, but yeah, I do see linkages, especially with Jacques Ellul rather than Gabriel Marcel, who's from earlier generation, but I cannot really place myself within what you call a Catholic tradition. The reason is that I have always been utterly unable to write about my faith. I do not have the gift for that. I have always considered that my life as a follower of Christ was something happening through my everyday life, not through my theoretical writings. It's not that I refuse to do it. I would gladly write a book about it, but I simply do not have the gift for it. You see, I do not have much of a theological culture. My conversion was an affair of the heart, a love affair, you might say, more than an intellectual one. So this is like a really interesting and like, man, another like just difficulty in kind of figuring out his Christianity, even though it is like we keep saying, kind of like fundamental to him, that he just like doesn't want to write about it because he's not good at it.
Yeah. And just to kind of continue, I'm just going to finish off that paragraph that you were reading. So he just says, speaking of religion, I feel much more at ease with an ordinary poor person. When I'm writing, I'm somewhere else. And that sort of topological throwaway line is very Virilio and very interesting to me. It's cool because when you read his work, I said this in the War and Cinema episode a little, but if you know that he's a Christian, you sort of see it peeking through in these interesting ways. You never get, like Jacques Ellul wrote literally like a confession at the end of his life. This is what I believe and what I think, etc. And Virilio never, well, at least so far, has never done that. But what is interesting is he has these moments where, for example, in The Aesthetics of Disappearance, which is a really famous, important book of his, there's a whole point in that chapter that revolves around Saint Bernadette of Lourdes and her visions of Mary appearing there. And he just uses her as the perfect example of what he's trying to say and how he's sort of working out his aesthetics of disappearance. Or in the I think it's called The Insecurity of Territory or The Security of Territory. I forget now. It's not translated, but I read about it in a different article. And in that book, he talks about the crucifixion as sort of the ultimate example of, a person getting executed by the state and why he doesn't like the state, etc. So it's really interesting because they're not doxological statements. They're almost like historical examples or philosophical models that he uses to kind of get at other things theoretically. And I think that's like a very interesting, almost methodology for even a Christian leftist in general.
Yeah, that he uses historical examples to like make sort of confessions a little bit. I mean,
yeah, exactly, yeah,
yeah, but they are also theoretically useful. I don't know, it's complicated, but actually very interesting in a method. Again, like I don't know, man, I'm over here in like lonely Protestant territory. We don't have cool saints to do that with. I mean, maybe a few. I don't know.
You've got Jakalul.
Yeah, no thanks. Nah, I think I'll be good. I think I'll be good not doing that.
Well, you do have Rudy Dutschke, who gets a mention in this very book.
Yeah.
In these interviews. So Rudy Dutschke, for people that don't know, was a German Protestant. Well, I mean, he was a Christian, but like also didn't write a lot about his faith. But he's a very important figure for the left in Germany. He was shot in 1968, but survived, and then he died later on. But so many interesting things about Rudy Dutschke. His wife was a Wheaton graduate. That's pretty hilarious to me. She was American evangelical. Yeah. So that's very cool. But anyway, he was a communist, Protestant communist, and Virilio mentions him in this book as kind of an aside. He just tells a story about how he was apparently supposed to get together with Rudy Dutschke at some point. Dutschke was going to come to Paris, but then hilariously, well, sadly, but it's funny how Virilio talks about it. I guess their meeting couldn't happen because Dutschke was like injured in a bombing, and Virilio was like, yeah, I was really bummed about that.
I'm also bummed about that. In one of the interviews, this is again another like sort of declaration of being a Christian and an anarchist, but without explaining much about what that means for him. But Virilio says, I was both Christian and an anarchist. You look surprised, but that's the truth. Paul Virilio was an anarcho-Christian. It's great that like I don't know. I like that. That's like that was the draw for him though. With Dutschke, it was like, oh well, that's a leftist Christian. Like maybe I could be friends with him and
yeah,
like let's make this happen.
That's right.
And then it didn't happen. So it's hard. It is hard to sort of pin down like specific expressions of Christianity in Virilio's work without reading between the lines, and I guess that's okay. It just makes it difficult for all of us back here. But I think a pretty interesting expression of his faith and his Christianity and its tie to his larger sort of theoretical project is the church that he designed with Claude Perrin. Dean, you're the expert on that, so maybe you could talk about the Church of Saint Bernadette for a minute.
Oh man, so many things to talk about the Church of Saint Bernadette. It is very cool. So Paul Virilio was, as we mentioned earlier, an architect for a short while, and he taught at an architecture school. But he only ever built one building, which I found very funny. And that building is this church. So it's in Nevers, France, near Lourdes, where Our Lady of Lourdes is said to have appeared in the 19th century. So anyway, there's a ton of interesting stuff about it. He talks about it in this book and elsewhere, and then there's a whole book called The Function of the Oblique, which is all about the church. But a few interesting things. So I've presented on this church in a few conference presentations, and every time it's like very fruitful. I think what I've found most intriguing and what sort of audience I've presented it to find most intriguing is that it's a really crazy building in that it's extremely sort of modern. It almost looks like a brutalist structure, but it's not. He explicitly rejects that in this book, like very angrily. He's like, no, I do not like Le Corbusier, etc. But it's built to sort of be like a bunker, like a gigantic bunker, which results from Virilio being a child, sort of exploring a ton of bunkers after the war had ended that were useless. So he builds this church as a bunker in the 1960s. And it's built at Lourdes. And there's all these symbolic dimensions that he plays off of by doing that. So, for example, a couple of just interesting things, because I'm going to talk about it forever if I don't limit myself here. One is, so it's built at sort of the height of the Cold War, and these tensions are growing between the Soviet Union and the U.S. in particular. And France is also trying to get, the ability to have nuclear weapons. That's an important thing. So he builds this church in the shape of a bunker, almost as a gigantic protest in a way. So it becomes sort of part art installation and part worship service, because it's a building that sort of testifies to a massive Catholic anti-nuclear sentiment. People in the U.S. might know about, for example, a ton of priests and nuns were known for like breaking into nuclear facilities and banging on warheads and pouring their blood all over them. So that was like a big deal for Catholics. So he builds this bunker where if you're going to worship God, you would have to do it in a place that sort of resists the fallout of, war happening all around them. So that's one cool sort of symbolic moment. The other is that the fact that it's built at Lourdes. So for people who don't know, the short version of Lourdes is like this little girl and her friends all went to this grotto, this cave in France, and apparently Mary appeared to her and she told a bunch of people, nobody believed them, and then eventually they did believe these little girls and they would go back, and Saint Bernadette in particular sort of led people there and had all these visions, and now people go there all the time every year. It's one of the biggest pilgrimage sites in the world to get sort of water from this healing cave. So anyway, that's where the church is built, and it's dedicated to this young girl, at the time a young girl. Now she's, she grew up, and she became a nun, and she died, and now she's a saint. So anyway, she, this cave, the grotto, the inside of the bunker church looks very similar to that kind of cave. They're similarly lit. They're similarly kind of dark and almost like womb-like in a way, and they both speak to this kind of healing moment and the ability to kind of have faith in a place where danger grows, etc. That's kind of what he says in these interviews. So yeah, I mean I could say like a billion more things, because I've written 2 papers about it, so I'm just gonna stop.
That's a really great introduction to to the Church of Saint Bernadette. Whenever I show it to students, this is like a side note that's very important. Whenever I show it to students, they always I show it to them and ask them like what it is, because it's supposed to be like a a visual culture kind of thing, and they're like, I don't know, it looks like a hungry hippo. And they're not wrong, it does look like a hungry hippo. But more importantly than that, it's like an interesting church because I don't know, it expresses like a certain idea about Christianity and what Christianity's place in the world is, and I guess how it should work with I don't know, all of the bad things that go on the outside. That it's like simultaneously a spot that is like for refuge, but also a spot that's for worship and like connection and renewal. There's a great quote from him after he's explaining the church a little bit more in these interviews, and he says, I think probably the most telling thing about his Christianity yet. He says, "I am a Christian, but I am also totally committed to the political issues and struggles of the times that I'm living in." So the bunker church is like about that. It's about being both a Christian, but both and recognizing the political reality of pure war or whatever.
Yeah, and also another thing about that I thought was so interesting when he's talking about the construction of the church is he says that if he had been building a church dedicated to St. Francis of Assisi, it would have been a different church. He says it would have been a transparent church, a church for the birds. And I just love that about Virilio, that he's trying to capture sort of one moment in the Christian narrative here. And I think it would be really easy to look at the bunker church, to look at Virilio's work in general, and kind of write him off as like a very brooding sort of Christian thinker, and really depressive, but actually he's not. It's just that he's clearly skilled at kind of capturing this sort of sentiment, so he's done it very well, but he's certainly not reducible to that sentiment.
Right, yeah. He could have made a bunch of different churches with different themes. It's not like this is his thing.
Though we should say one of my favorite stories in this whole thing is when he's talking about the reception of the church. I love that story so much. So he says, yet not everyone shares my politics or my particularly Christian vision. For example, when the bunker church was consecrated by the local bishop, the priest who was conducting the ceremony was walking around the building and performing the sign of the cross. Now, the public, myself included, was inside the church. Consequently, we didn't know what was going on outside because we were patiently waiting for the massive consecration to begin. However, a few years ago, the priest told me that while the bishop was outside consecrating the church, he was constantly muttering to himself the following words: "What a ghastly thing, amen. What a ghastly thing, amen." At this point, my friend the priest turned towards the bishop and said, "Monsignor, this is not an exorcism, it is a consecration."
so far we've kind of talked about a few traces of Christianity and how they come out in his work. Sometimes he speaks about it kind of explicitly and sometimes less so. Sometimes he just talks about how hard it is to talk about Christianity, which I can sympathize with even. Maybe I want to read one more quote about him, about his Christianity, and then maybe we can move on to talking about some other Virilio stuff.
Yeah.
But this takes so forgive me for doing this because this might be very unpopular. But Paul Virilio has a really interesting, I don't know if it's really interesting, it's interesting, interview in Vice on the website. Dean and I think, have had a lot of conversations about how we don't like Vice very much for reasons. That's a different podcast episode. They just have a bad aesthetic, it's just like stone frat bro showing up in the DPRK and
and just talking about how weird it is.
Yo, this place is nuts. That's the next episode of Rod Dreyer fanfic, but it's it's like
a Vice documentary about Rachel Held Evans' basement.
Yeah, that's right. Yo, here we are down here with Rod Dreyer. What's up? This place is crazy. I just smoked a bowl. What's going on?
There's foosball here. There's a lot of really old breadsticks. I don't know.
Really old, yeah. It's not Rachel Held Evans' house anymore, though. It's now just like an abandoned Olive Garden. Okay.
An abandoned Chick-fil-A.
That's even better. Next to a Hobby Lobby, like the spookiest Hobby Lobby. Okay, that's a really great. I don't know. Okay, I don't.
It fits with the Bunker Church. It's a perfect segue.
Yeah,
I don't know
that's true. I don't. It's
yeah.
It's actually, yeah, we should have thought of more explicit jokes about Bunker Church and also Rod Dreyer. It seems prime. But anyways, so there's this thing in Vice, and this someone from Vice is asking questions, and so Paul Virilio says this. I don't know. The guy from Vice asked some inane question. It doesn't matter what the question actually is because it was stupid. Look it up. We'll put a link or whatever. We'll put a link on the show notes if you want to look at the article. But Virilio says this. Being a Christian, again, he's always quick to say that, I have to say that I participate in what St. Paul called a hope against all hope. It means that in a way I see hope behind the threat of apocalypse. It doesn't put an end to humanity. It's possible but not certain. And at the bottom of the pit, there's only hope. So this underlying hope in the face of war and apocalypse and all kinds of other terrible stuff is I think a key moment and a key movement in Paul Virilio's thought that people miss out on, I guess. That hope is hope, and specifically a Christian hope, is central to the way he thinks about eschatology, I guess. That he doesn't see the end of the world being with a nuclear bomb. That there's always hope kind of beyond the terrible things we do to one another in war.
Yeah, which is crazy because if you read any book by Virilio, you won't probably come out feeling hopeful against hope. Rather, you would have to be hopeful against hope. It's the latter part that's the operative phrase. So I think it's really interesting that he says things like that because I find Virilio just very unsettling and really, creepy, frankly.
Yeah.
And he's certainly not an optimist, but he's intentional to say that he's also not a pessimist. He's just sort of trying to be aware of how bad things really are. But that's exactly why that hope sort of sustains him in an interesting way. I think that's a very good way, too, of talking about why religion is constitutive for him. He couldn't really plumb these depths without that.
Yeah. Completely. This reminds me of this really profound moment in my undergraduate career. This shouldn't cross a line into weird evangelicalism, but who knows where we'll end up, So I was in
Hope Against Hope.
Hope Against Hope. That it doesn't end there. So I was in this class and we were reading a book by Sam Wells. Do you know Sam Wells?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He's a Methodist Episcopal, I don't know. I think Episcopal guy. I don't really know or care.
That I
it's
don't
not
know.
important. But sorry, he was like a schismatic kind of guy, and he has a book that's called Improvisation, and it's about Christian ethics as like and like improvisational like techniques of like, you read the Bible so you know what to do. And it sounds kind of cheesy, and it is, but there is this kind of part at the end that really resonated with me that I thought was really profound, where he talks about like eschatology in Christianity, and about how, like, if you kind of stick with the script of Christianity in the grand cosmological scheme of things, like, how the universe ends. I mean, like, that there's like that necessary apocalyptic and hopeful event at the end of time for Christians, not in the sort of like fundamentalist millenarian sense, but like in the sort of like grand scheme of like the healing and restoration of all things to God or whatever. And it's like that same type of hope that I think I see in Virilio, where it's like, yes, things are bad and people do awful things, haven't we made technologies that are just terrible? But there's still like room for like for hope and all of that like it'll end like in some kind of just and good way.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because he says in some of the places he resists being called an apocalyptic thinker, which, I don't know, that's really complicated. There's a lot to say about that. But why he says it is he wants to say, I'm not sort of like a Chicken Little philosopher, running around saying the sky's falling, whatever, get ready for doom. Instead, he says, however, though, he does think that there is an end of a world. It's just not the end of the world.
Right.
And he thinks that ends are sort of opportunities. And the nice thing about Virilio is he actually doesn't say that we will seize it. It's not like, and it's an opportunity that we'll take and we'll sort it out. Don't worry about it. But it's still there. And that really fits with a lot of his stuff. Like in the Aesthetics of Disappearance, one of the most helpful things about it for him is that our whole perception is made up of just like tons and tons of accidents and like little, shades of things that we don't even know that we're perceiving. It's a very sort of Walter Benjamin kind of point, where every moment, as Benjamin says in the Concept of History essay, every moment is sort of a straight gate through which the Messiah might enter, right?
Yeah.
And Benjamin is certainly no optimist.
Yeah, there's just like a promissory quality to history.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great connection to make, actually. I didn't think about that. Huh.
He is a reader of Benjamin, too, so...
Yeah.
I'm really just pulling it out of him.
I mean, like, good.
Which is to say, I'm not original.
Yeah.
That's all.
Does he talk about that somewhere, like, explicitly, Benjamin?
I don't know if he talks about the Concept of History essay. I mean, he probably does. I just can't think of it off the top of my head. But, like, Benjamin comes up over and over again in his stuff.
Cool. Yeah. I mean,
I'll go Google it later.
it's like not important right now. So all this stuff about like hope in Christianity and like war makes me ask the question, like a really I don't know, a hard question. So Paul Virilio is like, he is a Christian and he's committed to talking and dealing with like the actual problems that exist alongside him. So that's the thing he says. He's an anarchist. And I wonder if we can make any kind of judgments about his Christianity and anarchism, and in terms of like Jacques Ellul's, even like in terms of like a pacifism in Christianity. Because he definitely does have a certain, I mean, like, he talks about violence a ton, and he doesn't describe it like it's a good thing. He's like a great historian of war and science and technology. I wonder, though, do you think that there is like a Christian pacifist like ethic behind any of this, or do you think that's just kind of like speculation?
It's so hard to nail down. This is a perennial problem for me, actually, as a reader of Virilio, and I've asked some people, like some people who've, whatever, made it their lives sort of working on this stuff, like good secondary sources and emails, and I keep getting the same response, actually, that it's actually really hard to sort out what Virilio's ultimate commitments about violence are. Like, it's very clear that he's anti-war. That's what he'll say, without any qualification. But is war the same thing as violence? And then he'll go on to say something like, well, compared to the state, like, we should be absolutely nonviolent. But then he'll talk about state violence as a very particular sort of category. So I don't know. It's really hard. I mean, he's anti-nuclear violence. You know, he thinks that like living in a society of total war and nuclear deterrence and the threat of constant annihilation is very bad. So he's anti that. But at the same time, like he participated in the 68 activities, which were violent. I don't think he was violent in those, actually. He basically just sat in a theater the whole time. I mean, it depends on what you think violence is. But anyway, it's not clear what he thinks violence is.
Yeah,
to me.
It is. It's hard, I guess. I guess when I think of him and I read him, so I've been reading. I feel like I read his books like kind of constantly, but I read Virilio Live all the way through the other day, and then right now I'm like reading Open Sky, and I get the feeling at least that saying that he's a pacifist is probably too much. That would be my judgment, and like saying I think saying he's anti-war is right though. I just don't get.
It's weird though because he owns the label of pacifist in some interviews. Yeah. But even there, it's like, but what do you mean by that? Yeah. I mean, does it mean that you're committed to peace? Well, okay, like that, he surely is. But so, you know, Marxists would say that they're committed to peace, and they're certainly not
pacifists,
anti-violent in a certain way, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. I guess there's like, I mean, there's nothing really at stake with him being a pacifist or not, because I guess, okay, sorry. When I was saying that thing a minute ago, where it seems like he's anti-war and not a pacifist, I guess like, there's like a really subtle Christian politics here of like, I don't know. He's not like Hauerwasian or something. Like,
yeah, for
right?
Sure.
Like he has like I think a way better critique of war than Hauerwas does.
Yeah, that's right. It's not like a Yoder thing.
Yeah.
Right. And in that way, it's also not an Elul thing. Like he's not opposed to violence necessarily because the Bible tells me so or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is a Yoder Elul Hauerwas kind of move. Which I guess isn't to say that Virilio, I don't know what he thinks about the Bible and violence, but there's a lot more to it. For him, it's a whole logic of, you know, like in Speed and Politics, he says that contra what Marx says about how history moves at the speed of its class struggle, Virilio says history moves at the speed of its weapons technology, which he thinks is a very bad speed. So, yeah, it's frustrating because every time this question comes back to me, I always feel like I should just be able to Google this and find like a really obvious passage that I'm just being, you know, a bad reader and not seeing. And you'd think that there would just be 1,000 secondary articles about why he is or isn't a pacifist, but there aren't, at least not to my knowledge. So yeah, I don't know, live problem, and probably definitely, I would say, connected to his Christianity somehow, but how? I guess that's always the big Virilio question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the challenge for reading Virilio as a Christian, really, is how? How?
Yeah, I don't know. Also, we're asking these like really analytical questions of him and his politics, and I get the feeling. Okay, so there are a few parts. So there's another book of his, like, it's not really a book of interviews, but it's like the transcription of a class that he taught at the European Graduate School. It's a book called Gray Ecology, and it's really interesting.
Right.
There's like a part in that book, I think, where somebody presses him kind of hard on a philosophical issue, and he kind of responds with like, well, I'm not a philosopher, I don't know. And I wonder if he might say something like really similar though, like you know, we're asking, like we want to know about these like nuanced sort of like Christian political ideas, and he's like, I don't know, man, I'm just a Catholic, I can't deal with this. Like,
yeah, actually, in that same book, Gray Ecology, there's a point where someone presses him again on a sort of similar, different context, but a similar sort of logical problem that we're asking here, where they say, I'm pretty sure it's about art, so it's like someone being like, what should artists do? I don't know, it seems like everything's very bad. And Virilio says, I think I should probably just quote St. Augustine, who is a doctor of the church. And he says, Augustine says, do whatever you want, just do it with love. And, you know, I don't know, maybe he would say the same thing about things like violence or resistance or whatever.
Yeah, that would be, I mean, who knows? It's like speculation, but that'd be very on brand of him to say. Gotta preserve that brand, that hot Virilio brand.
Virilio brand. That's right. All right, so maybe we could talk a little bit about Virilio's relationship to some of his contemporaries, which comes out a lot in this book, and I think is very interesting as a Christian in France in the time that he is writing, through the 60s in particular. France's philosophical scene is very weird in the 60s. There's a ton of communists who are sort of giving up on communism or finding alternatives or pushing communism in weird directions, partly due to like Stalinist revelations and that sort of a thing. So it's really fascinating because a lot of them have already given up on Christianity and then they found salvation in, Marxist movements, and then that was disappointing, so they moved on. But Virilio, it's weird. Like, he keeps hanging with them in an interesting way, despite the fact that he's like an anarchist and a Christian, which is a marked contrast from the beginning of Ellul's Anarchy and Christianity, where he's like complaining about how Guy Debord was like just not a friend of his at the end. Whereas I think like Debord probably would hang with.
Well, there's a part, I don't know, where Virilio is talking about like, I don't know, like some 68 and then post 68 stuff where he's just like, I don't know, we were like, I was reading the Situationists, like we were like writing to them. So, yeah. Like, so it's, man, I will double down on my speculation from the Ellul episode that Ellul's a nerd and no one wanted to hang out with him.
Yeah, poor Ellul. He was on that hill metaphorically.
Yeah, that's right. Not being vaccinated. That's like sort of the.
Yeah, actually, in a weird way, for real though, he's sort of like afraid of being sick with like the contagions of other postmodern philosophy in a way that Virilio sort of just opens himself up.
Yeah,
to.
There's lots of room for like sort of the psychoanalysis of Ellul. Like, a completely like that's a research avenue that is not fruitful and that no one wants to read about, so let's just not talk about it.
Free grad work, I guess.
Somebody out there. Yo, at like weird side note, at Wheaton they have like the Ellul archive or something.
Oh yeah,
so
that's right.
Y'all Wheaton dudes listening to this for sure. There you go. There's an idea for you. Yeah, so all of the interviews in this book are super interesting, but to me, like the most helpful were the sections where somebody just asked him about like, what do you think about Lyotard? What do you think about Baudrillard? What do you think about Foucault? And you can like you get like some interesting insight into like why he is hanging with these guys, because he's like clearly friends with them all, and I don't know, he always says that he's their friend, they're friends. But it's interesting because you get to see a little bit of like what he thinks of their work, and it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Maybe could we do like a speed run of just like, here's what he thinks of this guy, here's what he thinks about that guy.
Okay, so John Armitage, the interviewer, asks Virilio, "Hey, what do you think about Lyotard?" Virilio says, "Yeah, he was right." Okay.
Okay, Derrida. Here's a good one. So Armitage says, what do you think about Derrida? Virilio at first says, yeah, we have no points of contact in our work. And then not long after that says, yeah, I'm a Christian because justice is indeconstructible. So I don't know what to make of that.
So there are no points of contact between our work, but actually everything that Derrida says about justice is right. There you go. I mean, that's fine. I don't care. Good for Virilio, I guess. Don't want to dilute the brand again. Let's see. There's a part where he talks about Deleuze and Guattari. They're friends. They're cool.
Yeah, Deleuze and Guattari, also, quick sidebar, are big fans of Virilio. They quote him in 1,000 Plateaus a couple times. And then my favorite moment is Deleuze at one point defends Virilio from Foucault in his book on Foucault. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a perfect segue into what does Virilio have to say about Foucault?
Virilio says that Foucault is very good. Well, I mean, at least in terms of the Panopticon, there's actually this really interesting anecdote where Virilio is talking about one of his like students, and the diagram for the Panopticon that was published in Discipline and Punish is from one of his students or something, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That there's that Foucault is talking about like optics in prisons, and Virilio is talking about optics in war, and there's like a sort of resonance between them there, and that's interesting. I mean, like it's just like it's funny because like the side note, I guess here, history of philosophy is like basically philosophers like yelling at one another and saying like, no, you're wrong. But like Virilio's a cool figure because he's just like, yeah, like Yeah, that's good. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, and this
except Derrida.
Yeah, except Derrida, who
he just steals that one.
Though I think the most interesting sort of relationship or contemporary of Virilio is Baudrillard. Baudrillard has a real special place in my heart. I like read so much of him in my master's thesis, so whenever anyone says anything about Baudrillard, I'm like very interested. It's pretty evident from this and other places that they were kind of friends. But like, I have no idea how those two guys would have ever gotten along. I don't know how anyone would get along with Baudrillard because he's just like, he's the most negative of Nancys. Like,
Virilio is kind of a negative Nancy too. I mean, it's telling that all the interviewers have to basically throw him the pitch of hey, why are you so scary? And then he says, oh no, I'm not that scary. I read St. Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Well, as far as Baudrillard goes, Virilio has these like actually really interesting disagreements with him. Okay, at one point, Virilio says, "Now, as far as Baudrillard is concerned, there's for sure something about his work I have never liked at all, and that is his concept of simulation." So basically, what Virilio is saying is that anything Baudrillard has ever written, he doesn't like. I mean, except like 2 books, maybe like 3. I don't know. But Virilio even goes on to say that he doesn't. He says, I do not believe in simulation. To me, what takes place is substitution, not simulation. It's like whole like disentangling of like why substitution is different than simulation and this whole thing. But it's interesting too because bound up in there is Baudrillard's nihilism and Virilio's hope, and somehow their pessimisms could like mesh enough to be friends, but like not to agree on anything.
Yeah, well, so in his conversation about Baudrillard, there's an interesting way that we can go back to what we were talking about with respect to Virilio's weird sort of sources of hope, because I think it's really important to not reduce Virilio's eschatology or his, hope in whatever, his hope in general to, a very run-of-the-mill Christian assumption that, whatever, maybe we'll all die, but at least we'll, like, go to heaven and, I don't know, get our wings and, like, play the harp and the cloud forever and everything will be fine. There's, like, a really interesting point where, so John Armitage, the interviewer, is pushing him really hard, and he says, isn't there some kind of connection between your work, Virilio, and his, Baudrillard? And Virilio says, absolutely none whatsoever. But he goes on to qualify it by saying, as I've said and repeated often, there's a nihilistic dimension in Baudrillard's writings which I cannot accept, as you were just saying. It's quite clear to me that Baudrillard has totally lost faith in the social. To me, this is sheer nihilism. I've not at all lost faith in the social, and here's where I think the hope thing really comes out. So he says, first of all, I believe that the social eludes the so-called social sciences and always has. That's why I'm not a sociologist. So I'm disappointed, and very much so, about politics. We'll talk about that soon. But I'm not disappointed by the social. You need only to go into the streets and meet the poor. They're extraordinary, superior people. The social drama leaves the stunts of the political class far behind. The power and resilience of individual people in the streets puts the intelligence of today's political leaders to shame, and as far as the social scientists are concerned, the less is said, the better. Which is also an important slight because Baudrillard did consider himself a social scientist.
Yeah, that's right. In the Shadow of Silent Majorities is the book where, that's the book where he was a social scientist, and then he like obliterated social science as a field.
Yeah.
That's right. every Baudrillard book though. It's like where he's a thing, and then he blows that thing up. It's nice. It's fun. It's a good and fun thing. Yeah, man. I think that as a reader of Baudrillard, I think Virilio is very right. Baudrillard is like, man, he's such an interesting person because of that nihilism. Like, he's fun to read on the one hand because of that that nihilism. At the end of Simulation and Simulacra, there's this like really amazing section called On Nihilism, and it's really fun because he's like, there's this quote, and this is probably what I need to get like tattooed in my body or something. It's just it says like, to be a nihilist would be too beautiful, would be too revolutionary. Like there's no room even for nihilism anymore. it's like Baudrillard says in like an abandoned mall in the Midwest, smoking clove cigarettes. Nihilism is too beautiful. It's too great.
Yeah, like sitting around like a bunch of like broken in televisions and like thrown away iPhones. Yeah, that sounds.
Well, I mean, it's just like the idea that you could destroy something and it be over is like that's too hopeful for Baudrillard even. And like I get it, but come on, like stop.
Yeah. And that's why it's cool. Like Virilio's hope is sort of it's not just like in justice as a kind of limit condition or in God or whatever, or Paul's eschatological vision, but it's like in the streets and in actual people that you meet. That's a very liberation theology move.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you need only to go to the streets and meet the poor is a very like a very Christian thing to say and a very anarchist thing to say.
Yeah, that's right.
That's cool. Okay, well maybe to like I guess like round this section off, there's one more contemporary that he's asked about, and it's Agamben. And Virilio says Homo Sacer is a good book.
Speed round over. little bit of a speed bump on Baudrillard there.
Yeah, Baudrillard was a speed bump. Speed bump Driard. Okay, now that the speed round is over, there's like one more person that Virilio mentions that I think is just like I don't know, like a weird shout out because of the things that have recently happened in world historical events. But Virilio mentions Jean-Marie Le Pen and the Front National in France. That's pretty funny.
Well, it's worth actually talking about why he mentions Jean-Marie Le Pen, because this actually pulls us maybe like not full circle, but to the end of this book at least, where he's talking about what he's doing now at the time of these interviews and his political participation and that sort of a thing. And that's where he kind of makes this statement.
John Armitage, again, the interviewer, asking like an amazingly helpful question that's not always obvious in Virilio's work. So John Armitage asked this question. I would like to ask the question on behalf of my students. This is a good teacher right here. For when I give a lecture on your work, there's one question that comes up over and over again at the end of the session. It usually runs something like this. While I find Paul Virilio's analyses of pure war and revolutionary resistance against the military-industrial complex extremely thought-provoking, I'm not quite sure what he's suggesting I actually do about these issues at the political level, at the level of the level of the everyday. What, in your view, should one tell them? So John Armitage is a saint because this is like always. Yeah, I mean, like this is what everyone asks, not just his students. Like nobody knows.
I mean, we were asking it just like a few minutes
ago.
Yeah,
exactly.
About violence.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, but what Paul Virilio says, he's like what he is actually doing is pretty fascinating too.
Yeah.
So, okay, he participated in the events of May 68. He was against the atomic bomb. Okay, good. But like since all of that, he explains that he was on a committee. A committee of a number of private associations which work together with homeless people. These are Christians associations for the most part. So he's like, I guess, like working with the private organizations to supply housing for the homeless. That sounds okay.
Yeah. Well, I should back up a little bit because one thing he says in between that is that the reason he's doing it is so he participated in these activist efforts and he just got, it looks like really burnt out.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, I became very disappointed about political struggles since they appeared to me to lag very much behind developments both within the post-industrial revolution and technoscience. So that's like a idiosyncratic problem for Virilio. But then what he ends up doing is because he's not participating in, I don't know, parties or something presumably, but is participating in the church, he participates in these other kinds of extra political activities. But I like how he frames it because he says the only action I can partake in takes place within the urban realm, with homeless people, with travelers, with people whose lives are being destroyed by the revolution brought about by the end of salaried work, by automation, by delocalization. Way better than acceleration is, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate, too, that it isn't just like, oh, I got burnt out, and now, I don't know, I just, like, give lectures, you know?
Yeah.
Like, that's a sort of standard academic move. Like, you as a young person, you participate in movements, and then you get older, and you kind of, if you don't become a conservative, you become the next worst thing, which is just, like, a person who talks about action or whatever.
Yeah.
I appreciate that Virilio did neither of those things. He's really putting his sort of architectural skills to work in these other ways that are actively benefiting what, we were just talking about with respect to the social. Like, he still has faith in human beings and thinks that those needs should be addressed, even if it doesn't come from political leaders or whatever.
Yeah, and just, like, I don't know, low-key trying to, like, get housing situations for homeless is like a very good thing to do, like, in terms of, like, activism and also in terms of, like, Christian virtue. He's like the Christian leftist, like Jimmy Carter or something. Like out there building houses and I don't know, not really. He's
literally Habitat for Humanity.
That would have been like a really disappointing answer.
Yeah. But we should say this too. So the Le Pen thing, it comes out in this context because he says, these are Christian associations, the things that he's working with to make these houses, and he says there lie my political activities these days. I'm a disappointed man of the left. And I love this next line. He says, by the way, this is no fun because at the same time, there's the rise of extremist political parties like Jean-Marie Le Pen's Front National and so on. So I really like that, where it's like, I'm not like having a good time by not participating in these organizational struggles. Like, you don't get the impression that he's like, everyone should just quit and start making, like concentrating on the social like he's Bruce Mao or something. It's like, it's kind of a bummer that this is where he ended up.
Right. You see some of that disappointment and that, like, I don't know, that real... I don't know, it's that evident of every, like, 68 era leftist. But he's just being, like, way more upfront about it and, like, probably more proactive than others. That's like, I'm bummed. It's no fun. I agree.
Yeah. And even being able to name that opposition, it's like, well, the right is organized and the left isn't, and that just really sucks.
Yeah. This is actually a really bad thing to end on, because now I'm also bummed.
Okay, let's not end here then. Let's circle back to the way in which his Christianity actually sort of helps him, deal with some of these affective feelings and emotions, because it's not just like a coping mechanism for him. It's the kind of thing that really keeps renewing him, and it's the kind of thing you would need to not end up like Baudrillard in a way, to actually participate in something even as small and as big as making housing solutions, not just for homeless people, but for people who are actively getting screwed over by the trends that Virilio himself has kind of been prophesying for the last 40 or 50 years. Like, that's really a cool thing.
Yeah.
It's why sometimes, honestly, I wake up on Sunday and I don't want to go to Mass because I think Mass is very boring. Like, I don't really have these kind of romantic visions that some of my Catholic friends do about, like, waking up and being super pumped to, like, take the Eucharist. Like, I don't get that, and it's nothing against it. I don't think I'm, like, a cool person for feeling that way, but I do genuinely sometimes wake up and think, oh, man, like, Virilio goes to Mass, and that seems to be very helpful to him, so, like, I guess I'll go.
Sort of at the end of this, though, I think that we've kind of made the point that Virilio's Christianity is important to understand his work at large. There's, like, a ton of other stuff and other ways that Christianity plays into his, like, sort of thoughts on media and instantaneous communication. He has a ton to say about, like, relativity and, like, the metaphysics of Christianity and how they play together in these weird ways, and all kinds of other things about technology that are just, like, incomprehensible unless you have some type of, like, understanding of Christianity or a Christian framework itself. So don't read don't read Virilio, like he's not a Christian, y'all. That's all I'm trying to say. That's the only point here. Is just like it's like don't be weird about that.
Yeah, well, I mean that's a good segue to talk about our attempt to read Virilio this summer. Insert commercial jingle here. All right, so Virilio should be read as a Christian. Hopefully, we've given some reasons why, even if indirectly. But there's a ton of stuff that we didn't even talk about, and it's not just the case that there are these subterranean Christian influences that Virilio talks about in interviews. It's also very upfront in other contexts, and he talks about things like idolatry critique and how science is sort of taking over the role that God has played in our societies, and he has things to say about that. He'll talk about mysticism and, all these different things. So there's actually a lot to be mined from him, but a lot of people aren't doing it. So at the Magnificast, we thought it might be fun to do that together a little bit over the summer, not in a massively detailed way, but sort of casually with like-minded folks and friends. So here's something of a pitch. If Virilio sounds interesting to you and the conversation and the themes we're bringing out seem interesting, and you want to read more in a context with other people, we're setting up a reading group to go through some of Virilio's texts through like Google Hangout, essentially. So you can sign up at a Patreon account that we'll link in the show notes for this episode. We're just going to charge $1, essentially, because we think it's probably helpful to have a little bit of a buy-in and motivation to keep reading, because it's no fun if, like, 2 people are reading all summer. So we'll focus on some of the places where Virilio's Christian commitments are a little more obvious, and then look at, like, different phases of his work to give you a sense of, where he's been and where he's going. So, yeah, if you want to participate, you can donate at the Patreon account, and hope to see you there. We're going to hopefully get some people to kind of come in and also answer some questions for us. So, yeah, stay tuned.
Okay, thanks for listening again to episode 7 of the Magnificast. Be sure to message us on Twitter if you have any questions or thoughts or any topics you want us to talk about. We're open to that. Otherwise, leave us a review on iTunes, or at least subscribe. Tell a friend. I don't know. Listen to us more. That's it. Anyways, thanks for listening.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up, keep your hoods up.